Joan Biskupic, and CNN political analyst David Gregory. As we look at all of this, obviously, Joan, everybody's trying to handicap this. Where could we go with these four? And there is a fair amount being made of a real push. People trying to get to the president to say, let's go with the path of least resistance, essentially.
That's right. This all comes down to both credentials and confirmability. And for, the last 2 weeks since Justice Kennedy announced his retirement, it's all been about who's going to be the splashy candidate that Donald Trump will pick. But now he's got to think about who can he get through without spending too much political capital and making sure Mitch McConnell can work with who he chooses. And I would say, Erica and John, we kind of fall into two categories here once we get to those four. Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett could be more lightning rods for the opposition, frankly, for like two different reasons. One, because Brett Kavanaugh has such a large record. He's probably the most credentialed of the four, but that also means that he has more to pick apart. He's been in Washington since the early 90s, worked for Ken Starr, worked for George W. Bush, has been on the Federal Court of Appeals for 12 years. There's just a lot of material there. Amy Coney Barrett, conversely, has not much of a record. That makes her a little bit of a risk for the White House and also for senators. She was a Notre Dame law professor. She's now on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, based in Chicago. And some of her writings on religion left senators during her confirmation hearing expressing doubts about whether she would vote to uphold Roe versus Wade. The other two individuals have been on their appeals courts for, 11 and 12 years, but they don't have the kind of record that's as meaty. They're consistently conservative, but not in distinctive ways that could cause a fight at the outset, I would say. And that's Raymond Kethledge and Thomas Hardiman.
And David Gregory. Thomas Hardiman, we know, was the runner-up to Neil Gorsuch last time around. And it does seem that Hardiman has sort of taken a dark horse vaulting to the front of the pack here. We've been told that the president was calling people about Hardiman over the weekend. We know his sister had recommended Hardiman last time around. We know that he drove a taxi cab to work his way through college. Notre Dame and Georgetown would provide a contrast to the Harvard and Yale members of the court right now. He seems to be on the rise insofar as you can tell these things.
Yeah, but that could also just be a nod toward some of those, like his sister, the president's sister, advocating for him. He's a guy from Pennsylvania. It's a good biography, good politics. It is interesting, though. I mean, Justice Scalia used to make the point, as Joan knows better than I do, about more diversity on the court. And by that, he meant, in part, more educational diversity, not everyone coming from the top law schools in the country. A couple of things come to mind to me this morning on an important day for the president. Look at how he handled the Gorsuch nomination. This was something he did very much by the conservative book. He went with intellect. He went with pedigree. He went with somebody who was arguably to the right of Justice Scalia to put him on the court. Someone who had clerked for Scalia as well. What's interesting about Kavanaugh clerked for Kennedy as well. And you have to bear in mind, too, inside the legal world, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is the feeder to the Supreme Court. This is so high profile, and folks who have gotten on this court, like John Roberts before him, have been confirmed and have gone through a pretty rigorous test in the Congress. Remember, too, the D.C. Circuit handles something that conservatives care a lot about, and that is the administrative state. Government regulation is what comes before them every day. So this is where Kavanaugh has a very strong record that conservatives will like. So all those things Joan said are absolutely right. And the confirmability, this is a very tough vote. This, I think, for the president is a big legacy play here, too. He doesn't want to get this wrong, doesn't want to be too risky on this, though I'm sure he would love to nominate Barrett and really take on Democrats by nominating a woman with very strong views that they would perceive as being toward overturning Roe v. Wade. He can also do that later, should the seat become open by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I think that's some of the advice he's getting. So a lot of different factors here.
And we were talking a little bit about that actually even in just the break, the impact of the choice in the moment, right? And what that brings to the president. But also, John, we were talking about the lasting impact in terms of putting someone on that court who was going to, in his mind, hopefully continue to push things a little bit further to the right.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's obviously the aim. That's why you outsource this to the Federalist Society. The feeling is that we're going to check the box, make sure that the base is protected. And all this is done under the frame. The president can't resist doing the reality show frame for something as serious and legacy-driven as a Supreme Court nomination. But I think what's extraordinary about these final four, so to speak, is that Kavanaugh's experience, as David Gregory said, is being used against him. And that seems to be a dangerous sign of the times. We all get the political risk of having a long record, but that's the kind of thing that would normally qualify someone to be a great jurist. The downside for some Republican or libertarian-minded critics is he is a Bush guy. He's a big defender of presidential prerogative, and that could be valuable to President Trump down the road. What's interesting is McConnell, over the weekend, allegedly calling the president to push Hardiman and Kethridge, saying that their lack of as deep a bench, but their real solid conservative credentials makes it an easier lift for the Senate. So keep an eye on that.
We're going to shift gears in just a second. Before we do, Joan, you do so much reporting on this. Where is it this morning, do you think? If you had to put your chips in one basket, what would it be?
Well, it's funny you say that because I was thinking about what a past president would do. And I think a past president would go with Brett Kavanaugh just because he's tried and true. It would give the administration confidence based on his past record. But John, Erica and John, I just cannot predict President Trump based on past presidents. I don't think it's going to be Judge Barrett. I think that's a tough one, and that they, as John just mentioned, she might be worth saving for down the road so that she's more tested herself and readier for the confirmation process. I'm not betting money on this one, but I guess to answer your question, I would. I hate to say it. I hate to say it out loud.
Honest,
I hate to say it out loud because I don't want to, I would say Judge Kavanaugh would be the traditional pick. Let's just put it that way.
And what's interesting about this
bookies
to
are
me
unhelped by this assessment.
But what's so interesting to me is that this is an area where we have seen Trump really keep his own passions at bay and his own impulsivity at bay. That's the big test here, is whether he does something different, because he's got to worry about the confirmation, but also staying true to this kind of the judicial monastery of what's best as a more predictable choice.
He's been able to put his energy into theatrics of the whole thing.
Yeah, well,
golfing with Sean Hannity, setting up this arbitrary 9 p.m. news conference and teasing to it for 8 days and still claiming he's still thinking about it. So maybe he's getting something out of that.
But I want to say one other thing to Erica's point about just how long-lasting this is. You, your children, and your children's children will be living under the law of this new justice.
Right. All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but it will not be the last time we have this conversation, obviously. Thank you all. Stay with us, too. Special live coverage of the President's Supreme Court announcement. That will happen tonight at 9 p.m.
Morning, an eyewitness tells CNN that a 5th boy has been carried out of the cave. This happened about an hour ago exactly. The rescue operations have begun again there. 7 boys and their soccer coach remain trapped inside that flooded cave. They've been there now for 17 days. We understand this one rescued boy being airlifted to the hospital now. CNN's Matt Rivers live at that hospital in northern Thailand. Matt, what are you seeing?
Yeah, John, what happened, according to a source, is that boy came out of the cave, was put in an ambulance, driven to the helipad, and then shortly thereafter, my colleague Ivan Watson, who is outside the cave, heard a helicopter fly over. That helicopter now coming here to the hospital. Now, if it follows what we saw yesterday, John, with the first 4 boys, we're actually going to see the helicopter fly from that way, heading south down that road over there. They're going to land at an old airport. And then that boy is going to be put in an ambulance and driven right up this road behind me. That's the hospital there over my left shoulder. That's the emergency room where those first 4 boys were put in. And that's what we're expecting the 5th boy to see happen as well. Now, when that boy gets to the hospital, we've got some details in terms of what the hospital is doing to prepare for this. An 8th floor ward has been turned into a specialized, sterilized isolation unit. That's where all of these boys are going to be put in, and they're going to be kept in isolation for 1 to 2 days. Anyone who wants to visit them has to wear a protective suit, and they have to stay 2 meters away from the boys physically. There's a concern that their immune systems have weakened. They don't want them to catch any diseases, and they also don't know what illnesses the boys might have come out of that cave with. So an abundance of caution here at the hospital, and we expect the boys to have to stay in the hospital for somewhere between 5 to 7 days for observation. But still, John, this is miraculous progress. Yes, there are still boys and their coach trapped in that cave, but just a couple of days ago, none of this was guaranteed. This is an incredibly dangerous rescue mission, and so we're going to hopefully see these. But, oh, and you know what? We are hearing over my left shoulder right now a helicopter coming in. We can't see it quite yet, but we do hear a helicopter, so we assume that's going to be carrying the boy and hopefully getting him out of that hospital as swiftly as possible. Erica.
Thank you. And just to clarify one thing, I know we've touched on this, but just to remind people at home, while the boys may be in the hospital, the parents don't know which of these boys has made it out. And the parents had said that they wanted to stay together in solidarity over there at the site, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We've been at the hospital now for well over 24 hours. No parents, according to our sources, have come here. And it's at this point, it doesn't appear clear that the parents even know which boys were taken out. Even there's a lot of conflicting reports at this point. We've heard some names. We're not ready to report those names at all. So you can imagine that some of those names might have trickled back to the parents. But what we do know is that these parents have made the decision. They've gone through this horrific event together as a group so far, and it looks like they're going to stick it out as a group in a show of solidarity that when one boy comes out, it's not good enough. They want all of them to come out safely.
Matt Rivers, you had told us that you had heard a helicopter overhead. Has that helicopter landed? Can you see it from your vantage point?
We couldn't see it. Now, if it took the same flight path as yesterday, where it literally flew right overhead, as of now, we're not seeing that helicopter anymore. So whether it took a different flight path, I think it went to the left of where we are right now. But we do know the helicopter, the area where it would land would be south of here, but it didn't take the same flight path as it did yesterday. Otherwise, we would have been able to see it.
All right, Matt Rivers by the hospital in northern Thailand where these children who have been rescued from the cave are being taken, including, we believe, this fifth child rescued from that cave just 1 hour ago. Matt, please keep us posted as to what you see.
As we continue to follow those developments out of Thailand, a lot happening back here at home as well. Rudy Giuliani with some new demands. What would it take for the president to sit down with Robert Mueller? That's next.
I didn't say they have to prove a crime. What I said was they have to give us a factual basis, meaning some suspicion of a crime. For example, I can't initiate an investigation of my neighbor just because I don't like him, or just because he's politically different than me, which is really what happened here.
President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, clarifying a report that the president's legal team wanted the special counsel to prove it has evidence of Mr. Trump committing a crime before agreeing to an interview. Let's discuss with CNN law enforcement analyst Josh Campbell and CNN legal analyst Laura Coates. Laura, look, there's a large part of this, too, that is, it would seem, not necessarily a legal strategy, but perhaps a public relations strategy in terms of pushing this narrative of the president's that we have heard for so long of his view of what this investigation is and why it was started. That being said, how much of an impact do you think this is having, Laura?
Well, I think the largest share of all of Giuliani's statements is about the publicity campaign and has very little foundation in the legal realities here, Erica, because reality speaking, the president of the United States or any person being interviewed does not need to have the proof in the pudding by the prosecutors or an investigative unit before they actually have to be interviewed. In fact, that's never been the standard at all. Probable cause is one for search warrants. It's not one for an investigation. And a lot of the proof that he's looking for has already been meted out in the form of different guilty pleas, people who have been a part of the Trump campaign, including Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, Michael Flynn as well, and about their own involvement. So I think that Giuliani is looking for one last straw, one last lifeline here in order to say this is all part of a witch hunt and he need not comply, but that's far from reality.
No, I think we're doing a disservice to the concept of logic by saying that there's a cogent argument here being made by Rudy Giuliani. I think the fact of the matter is, and this is just my opinion, they've decided not to have the president sit down for an interview, at least not willingly. So everything else that's happening is just words spoken out loud to delay or muddy the waters in that process, Josh. And I think another sign that this is the case is that Giuliani, who's ostensibly the president's lawyer here, is saying things that don't actually help his case, like the issue with James Comey. Did the president ask James Comey to back off in the investigation of Michael Flynn. The president had said no, that never happened when he'd been asked about it. And Rudy Giuliani, well, let's listen to what he said, because he said, yeah.
The joint defense agreement that Cohen had with the president's legal team, that is no longer operable?
I'm not really allowed to talk about that, but it wouldn't matter whether it was or it wasn't. We think we know everything we need to know at this point.
And the president's legal defense fund is no longer paying Michael Cohen's legal bills? Again,
That's not something I'm allowed to comment on, but it wouldn't matter one way or the other. We want Michael to handle this in a way that's most helpful to him. Michael's not going to lie. He's going to tell the truth. As long as he does that, we have nothing to fear. He didn't direct him to do that. What he said to him was, can you give him a break?
Comey says he took it as direction.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I've taken it that way. I mean, by that time, he had been fired. And he said a lot of other things, some of which have turned out to be untrue. The reality is, as a prosecutor, I was told that many times, can you give the man a break? Either by his lawyers, by his relatives, by friends. You take that into consideration. But that doesn't determine that not going forward with it.
So, Josh, we just gave you a tour there of the words said out loud by Rudy Giuliani. What do you make of it all?
So it is not against the law to lie to the American people in the United States. If that were the case, the jails would be full, especially in this city. But what's interesting is that we now see the mayor now playing cleanup, which has kind of become his role. So the reason this is so important is because he's talked about the legal strategy and he's talked about the public opinion strategy. And he said himself, essentially, that this is more of a public relations issue. So it's not against the law to lie and to come out and say, well, the president said this, but let me say that. The pattern here is, if you think back to, Stormy Daniels and that payment where the president said on Air Force One that, I had no knowledge of this, I wasn't involved. And then, Rudy came in to do cleanup and said, actually, he did, but what he meant was this. That's the same case appears to be here with Jim Comey, where Comey said that he felt pressured and, the president said it never happened. And now Rudy is saying, actually, it did, but it's not as bad as you make it. What's interesting here, and we talk about these, linguistic, leaps in logic here. It's interesting when you talk about the relationship or the format that Rudy is operating in here when he talks about what it actually meant. He wasn't saying, hey, I want you to pressure it. He was saying, hey, let's give the guy a break. It's interesting because we're talking about a subordinate and someone who is working for him, which is important in this case. So this isn't just anyone coming and saying, hey, we need you to come and say this. Borrow a phrase from John Avalon slightly. This is more along the lines of, hey, that's a nice career you got there. It would be really bad if something happened to that.
Yeah, I mean, that parallel that Rudy was trying to draw just doesn't work because it's the president of the United States. And Rudy knows that. I mean, with regard to the Comey, line he floated out that seemed to contradict the president's, this may be filed under the Clinton defense team back in the 1990s called telling the truth slowly. The president took out a position. It may not be true. We'll sort of get the new reality out there. But at the end of the day, Rudy is playing squarely to the court of public opinion. He's trying to give the impression that the Trump team has much more leverage than they do. And on the issue of Michael Cohen, what you heard there was sort of the Alfred E. Newman strategy. What, us worry? Not at all. But it is a lot of bluster, and at the end of the day, there isn't that much they can do if a subpoena comes down, unless they want to have that fight. But this is about the court of public opinion.
Yeah, and just on that, John, sorry to interrupt, but I think on the public opinion side, it's so important that our viewers understand that. And let me just say, kind of full disclosure, when we talked about Comey, I served a stint as his assistant, so it's important the viewers know that. But with respect to, Rudy getting a peek at what's, behind the curtain here before they decide to sit down, that is not how the justice system works in the United States. When I heard him make those comments, I thought about all the interviews and interrogations I've done and wondered how I would respond if one of those subjects said, you know what, I'll sit down, I'll talk with you, but first I need a little peek at your files to see what we're dealing with here. I would have laughed them out of the room. And, in fact, it's actually more telling if someone actually comes and says, well, I want to know what you're talking about here, what you're dealing with, rather than full cooperation, which we expect from our leaders.
So, Laura, subpoena fight. Do you think Mueller will push this? Do you think Mueller will take this to court if, or as I think when, you definitively hear from the president he will not sit down willingly for an interview?
I think he certainly should do so. It has not been, laid down in the law definitively whether or not you can subpoena a president or whether you cannot subpoena a president. I remember Ken Starr infamously did try to do so for Bill Clinton, and the only reason he did not pursue it further is because there was then a voluntary agreement to cooperate and speak freely. And so I think he has in his power to do so, and certainly the person who is the head of the executive branch of government, under which the Department of Justice falls, where we routinely give subpoenas to people to say we want you to be a part of an investigation, even if you yourself are not the target or subject of the investigation, it behooves the President of the United States to adhere to that principle. Otherwise, what is the purpose of the Department of Justice and their power to give a subpoena if the President can thumb his nose at it?
All right, Laura Coates, Josh Campbell, thanks very much. Good discussion. You know who doesn't think the President should sit down for interviews in general in an criminal investigation? Brett Kavanaugh. Written extensively about this, one of the possible nominees for the Supreme Court.
On the Starr investigation.
Might he have to decide on something like this ultimately if he's nominated?
Would absolutely be interesting to see.
Stay tuned. All right, an extraordinary meeting between Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and North Korean leaders over the weekend. Many people saw this as a make or Korea offering starkly different views of talks this weekend. The Secretary of State called the meetings productive and in good faith. North Korea called them regrettable and said that the U.S. was making gangster-like demands. I want to bring in CNN Global Affairs analyst Max Boot and Daily Beast columnist and author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, Gordon Chang. Gordon, I want to start with you because you sat here with us last Friday and told us this was a make-or-break meeting for the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in terms of the goal of denuclearizing on the Korean Peninsula. What was it, make or break?
It certainly was break. You had, Pompeo say, oh, look, we've made a lot of progress. North Koreans then intentionally went out to embarrass him, even humiliate him. So it shows that Kim Jong-un is not negotiating in good faith. Remember that Trump policy is based on the assumption that Kim made a strategic decision to give up his nukes. Obviously, he hasn't. He's ramped up production of fissile material, and he's not negotiating well. So I don't think we can say that this was a make meeting by any sense.
Not even a little bit.
No, not even a little bit. The big question, of course, is then what happens now? Not only how do you massage this in terms of the public relations aspect of it, but can you walk away? I'm sure President Trump does not want to do that, but would it be the smart thing to do?
Well, I think walking away would be justified at this point because I agree with Gordon that there's no evidence that North Korea is interested in actually giving up their nuclear arsenal. But it's not so easy to walk away because, of course, Donald Trump would have to admit this has all been a massive failure. And remember, just a month ago, he was actually saying the North Korean nuclear problem is solved. So it would be quite a significant concession if he were to concede that it hasn't been solved. And the problem is that now his options are really limited because the maximum pressure policy of putting sanctions on North Korea is now effectively the minimum pressure policy because China is not enforcing the sanctions. And it'll be very hard for Trump to convince China to start reinforcing the sanctions, especially because now we're in a trade war with China, very badly timed trade war that Donald Trump has launched. So why would Beijing want to do any favors for Donald Trump?
Well, because we've got leverage on China right now because of the trade war. People say, well, if you want China to do something, you'd be nice to them. No, that's exactly the wrong way. We've been doing that for 2 decades and gotten really bad results. The way you get China to do something is give them no choice but to do what you want, which is to impose costs. And I think the costs that we can impose with regard to North Korea are just taking their big banks. All 4 of their big 4 have been handling money for North Korea. That's money laundering. That means we can disconnect them from the global system. That gives us a lot of leverage, Max.
And the important point there is not only that you're proposing a solution, which seems to be lacking, but the action that the Trump administration seemed to have gotten was by being tough on North Korea. That's what they seemed to respond to. The sunshine and light, build a condo in Pyongyang one day strategy doesn't seem to have worked terribly well. But I think Trump will be his instinct is going to be in an extended denial dance until the midterms about this. But the maximal pressure is what they should probably return to.
Well, Matt, but Mike Pompeo used the words for the first time again over the weekend after this unsuccessful meeting. The question is, will he repeat them, Gordon? Do you think he'll go back to maximum pressure? And do you think that maximum pressure is even possible anymore now that they have backed off of it?
Well, yeah, of course we've backed off, but maximum pressure is possible because, for instance, we could go back to designating their front companies. The administration declined to do that at the end of May. And that is effectively hollowing out sanctions because North Korea changes its front companies all the time. Right. You don't designate the new ones, you're effectively giving sanctions relief. And the Secretary of the State, by the way, has not been candid with the American people because he says, oh, we're keeping our pressure on. Well, no, we're not. We're giving them a free pass. And also, we're not imposing costs on the Chinese and Russians for violating sanctions. So this has been open season on sanctions.
And there's a lot to come. I mean, this week alone, as we're following developments out of North Korea, but if we look at just the calendar of what's coming up this week, of course, with NATO, and all of this leading up to the president sitting down, as we're told, one-on-one in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin, this has you can't ignore the fact that this is going to have an impact on not only what's happening in that meeting, but the way it's perceived globally, Max.
Right. I mean, Vladimir Putin has to be licking his chops at this point because he's seen the way that Kim Jong-un, this young, untested dictator, has really fleeced Donald Trump. This has been a masterclass in self-deception, the way that Donald Trump convinced himself that North Korea wants to disarm, and so far he's not willing to receive any evidence to the contrary. And so you have to wonder, you know, how does this play going into this meeting with Putin, who is remember, in the case of Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump was castigating him only a few months ago as Little Rocket Man and all this other stuff. Whereas with Putin, he's had nothing but kind and wonderful things to say about him throughout the course of his life. And so he is just ready to be fleeced here by Vladimir Putin. And Putin is ready to take advantage of this moment. So I think there's real cause for concern for anybody who cares about the future of the Western alliance, about what happens first in this meeting with NATO and then with this meeting with Putin.
Let's talk about the Western alliance, because there are a lot of NATO leaders in officials from these NATO countries who are very, very nervous right now about what the U.S. intentions are in Europe. What do you see, Max?
Well, I think there is cause to be very nervous because, you know, of what happened a few weeks ago at the G7 summit in Quebec, where it was basically the G6 versus G1, where Donald Trump was at odds with all of our allies. He insulted the Prime Minister of Canada. He talked about inviting Russia back in. And so this sets up a very ominous meeting. Now, right now, what you see in Europe is that the Europeans themselves are divided. Britain is distracted by the Brexit controversy. In Italy and in Hungary, you have right-wing pro-Russian governments. You have an authoritarian government in Poland. So Europe really needs some leadership here to take on Russia. And under any other president, the U.S. would provide it. But the concern here is that instead of trying to unite the Europeans against Russia, Donald Trump will do the opposite, that he will divide the Europeans and make huge concessions to Russia and put another nail into the coffin of the Western alliance. That's the real concern here.
Max Boot, Gordon Chang, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still to come, a fifth boy rescued from that cave in Thailand. The rescue operation for the other boys who remain trapped with their coach is underway. We have a live update.
In for Allison this morning, and the breaking news is out of Thailand. A fifth boy has been rescued from the flooded cave there, pulled about an hour and a half ago from inside. He arrived at the hospital just moments ago. There are pictures of that caravan arriving there in northern Thailand.
As he and 4 others are being treated, we know that rescuers are still frantically trying to save the remaining 7 boys and their soccer coach who remain trapped underground. They have now been there for 17 days. Oxygen levels are falling as water levels threaten to rise. We begin our breaking news coverage with CNN's Ivan Watson, who is live in northern Thailand. Ivan.
Good morning, Erica. That's right. Within the last hour and 40 minutes, CNN has learned that a fifth boy was rescued from deep inside the mountain and the cave system behind me. A rescue worker at the mouth of the cave saw the boy brought out on a stretcher. He was treated there at the mouth of the cave, checked up by medical personnel, then transported first by ambulance and then by a military chopper to a hospital where my colleague Matt Rivers is now located. Now, the rescue operation has been underway here since about 11 o'clock this morning. So it's about 7 hours it's been taking place now. There was success on Sunday evening when 4 other boys were brought out. This is a difficult and dangerous procedure. It involves some 90 people, including 13 foreign divers and around 5 Thai divers. The U.S. military has sent assets here, a search and rescue team as well, to assist in this effort. But we do know that one former Thai Navy SEAL died trying to bring help to some of the boys last week. So it just underscores how delicate this is. We know that the boys that were successfully brought out were brought out with full face masks so that they could have air over their whole faces. These kids are going through an arduous journey. It's tight, it is deep, and it's very hard to see, but there's some positive news. It has not been raining today. There was a forecast of downpours, and the lack of rain means less moisture, less water going into the cave system, meaning in some places the boys have actually been able to walk in just a few inches of water to reach safety. And we'll bring you just the news just as soon as we hear about more possible rescues that the authorities are suggesting might be coming in the coming hours.
Appreciate it. Ivan Watson for us again in Thailand. If the pattern does hold from yesterday, we could see a 6th or a 7th, perhaps an 8th child pulled from that cave in the next few hours. So we're watching that very carefully. In the meantime, The fifth boy, the one who was pulled out this morning, has now arrived at the hospital. CNN's Matt Rivers is there with the very latest. Matt.
Yeah, John, it was within the last 20 minutes or so that we saw a small convoy of 4 vehicles, including the ambulance carrying that fifth boy, pass right down this road behind me, going right to the hospital there, dropping the boy off at the emergency room exactly as they have done with the first 4 boys yesterday. So there is a pattern here being followed. The chopper landing at an airport south from here, and then the ambulance bringing the boy the final way. He now joins his 4 teammates in a special isolation ward on the 8th floor of that hospital, where basically we know that's a sterilized area. And what authorities are telling us is they're doing that out of an abundance of caution to make sure that if their immune systems are weakened, they're not infected by anything here above ground after spending so long down in that cave. Even if their parents can come visit them, and we aren't clear that the parents are even told which boys have been brought out yet, but even if parents are told and they want to come visit them, they have to wear special suits, and they can't get within 2 meters of the boys for at least 1 to 2 days while they remain in isolation. And then after that, we know that they're going to be held under observation for at least 5 to 7 days to make sure that they can properly recover after what has been a unbelievably horrific ordeal for them. The hope here amongst everyone you talk to, medical personnel, first responders, police that are just patrolling the streets, is that the beds that are open in that isolation ward fill up with more patients soon as rescues continue.
All right, Matt Rivers for us at that hospital in northern Thailand. Again, a dramatic morning so far. The news has been all good. A 5th child rescued from that cave. We're watching very carefully to see if more are pulled out. Again, yesterday there were 4. So the expectation is we could see more shortly. Joining us now, an experienced cave rescuer, Michael McDonald, and the CNN chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Michael, we're watching this. Again, it was about an hour and a half ago that the 5th child was pulled from that cave. I assume the expectation is we should very shortly see more, if all is going well.
That is correct, yes. Now they're on a roll and they have continuity. They'll want to do as much as they can with all the available facilities. So it's more of the same, and the rescuers will want to keep on going and bring as many as they can out in one operation. They don't want this to drag on for much longer, hopefully. So more of the same, keep on going.
Sanjay, we had heard initially there was some reporting that the healthiest, obviously a doctor was making the decision, we were told, about who would be brought out first. But Sanjay, the reporting was that the 4 who came out first may have been among the healthiest, which is sort of counterintuitive to what many people would think. But that could actually give them a better sense of what they need to do, right, Sanjay? And so it's maybe better to bring the healthy kids out first?
Yeah, this is a judgment call certainly being made at the time and taking all these factors into play. But you're absolutely right, Eric. I think medical triage, you know, if you think about most sort of medical triage situations, you take care of the people that you're most concerned about first. In this situation, because they needed to, every time they make one of these rescues, they're probably learning more information, figuring out how to do things in a more streamlined fashion. Maybe they figured the first time that they did the rescue with the 4 healthiest boys, they would not only have a higher chance of success, but also learn more that would increase the level of success for the rest of the boys. That's my guess. It is a bit counterintuitive, but perhaps makes sense with this type of pretty extraordinary rescue.
And Michael, if you are starting to get to some of these kids who might not be as healthy, if they did take the strongest ones out first, how will that complicate the rescue efforts?
Not at all. I think the decision to take out the healthiest first was the correct one, because it builds morale. If you can get the strongest out first, 4 or 5 of them, then that increases morale, and the news will get back to the boys still in the end chamber, and give them a great boost. So I think it was definitely the correct decision in this particular case. Normally, of course, the weakest or the injured are brought out first, but I think in this case, to bring out the healthiest first was definitely the right decision, because it raised morale greatly.
Michael, we just heard from Ivan Watson on the ground that in some areas, it sounds like the kids could actually stand and walk through a little bit of water, which is important. Just remind our viewers who may just be tuning in, waking up to this news, just how difficult it is to get through this, 4 kilometers? They're about 2.5 miles in there, and this is not just a straight shot to come out, Michael.
No, I think apart from a few places, most of the cave is actually quite large. So I think the boys would be relieved to get out of the water and stand on their own 2 feet and walk for a while. Give them a bit of exercise and a bit of morale as well. They're in a familiar situation, of course, walking in air and in an open space. So I think the fact that there is open passageway is a great benefit to them and means they can get out of the water, have a rest, recuperate, and then go on for the next operation.
Sanjay, the 5th child now arrived at the hospital. Walk us through the process of treating them. What are the priorities?
At the cave entrance itself, some decisions are made medically, basic medical decisions, ABC, airway, breathing, circulation. Are the boys breathing okay? Is there any indication their blood pressure has dropped, maybe because of dehydration? Is there any trauma? These types of decisions basically dictate whether how quickly the boys need to get to a hospital, by air, by ambulance, whatever it may be. Once they get to the hospital, as you might guess, hypothermia, dehydration, malnutrition, all of that in terms of their bodies will need to be addressed. Again, any trauma, and then this concern about could they have been exposed to some infectious agent in the cave, such as histoplasmosis. That is something that people who spelunk caves are familiar with, but basically it's these spores that can get into your lungs and cause disease. Were the boys' immune systems weakened as a result of a couple of weeks being in this cave? That's what the isolation and the quarantine is really all about. But recovering their bodies physically is something that they know how to do, they've been preparing to do. They've looked at the timeline of how long these boys have been in the cave from June 23rd to July 2nd before they were actually discovered alive. After that, they started to get food and supplies. Doctors, nurses look at that timeline as well to try and be predictive about what kind of shape these boys are going to be in. And keep in mind again, John, that they did get there is a doctor who assesses them in the cave before the rescue begins. So they have another piece of data there in terms of what kind of shape the boys will be in.
John Avalon here with us as well.
Yeah, Michael, presumably the coach will be the last person pulled out of the cave by rescue. But I wonder, given that the first 4 boys were taken first, then you had a refueling period, can we expect that will be the cadence going forward? That there's 5th child now out, 6th, 7th, 8th, then another break? Or could they try to get all the boys out of the cave at this critical period?
I think that they will try and get them all out in one operation if they can. As far as I understand it, the break in operations yesterday was due to the need to refuel tanks and to fill tanks. But hopefully they would have rectified that sort of slight hitch and got more tanks in so they can keep on going and bring them all out in one. I don't think they'll want another break if they can possibly avoid it.
The rain is coming, although they are limited by how many tanks can perhaps fit in those tunnels and caves right now. They're stretched to, I think, the full extreme of their limits. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, Michael McDonald, thanks so much for being with us. Again, we're watching this throughout the morning. That 5th child has arrived at the hospital. We're watching very closely to see if more emerge from that cave.
We'll bring you that as we have it. Meantime, back here at home, President Trump poised to make one of the most consequential decisions of his presidency when he announces his pick for Supreme Court tonight. He's turning this into a primetime television event. The president says he hasn't yet made a decision. The list, though, is narrowed to 4 finalists. CNN's Abby Phillip joins us now live from the White House with more.
Well, good morning, Erica. It is going to be a major week here for President Trump. He is on the verge of announcing his 2nd Supreme Court pick tonight at primetime here at the White House. But upon returning to the White House last night from Bedminster, New Jersey, where he spent the weekend, the president said he hasn't even yet made a decision.
I'm very close to making a decision. Have not made it official yet, obviously. Have not made it final.
President Trump teasing tonight's primetime Supreme Court announcement after some last-minute behind-the-scenes jockeying at his New Jersey golf club.
Well, let's say it's the 4 people, but they're excellent. Everyone, you can't go wrong.
Republicans praising the 4 leading candidates whose sources say include federal appeals court judges Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, Raymond Kethledge, and Thomas Hardiman, the runner-up to President Trump's first pick to the high court.
Republicans are holding 4 lottery tickets, and all of them are winners.
Sources tell CNN that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been urging President Trump to choose either Kethledge or Hardiman, who he feels will have the best odds of getting confirmed quickly in this crucial midterm year.
I think the president has to think about it. Who is the easiest to get confirmed here?
Democrats vowing to stonewall any nominee who would seek to overturn rulings protecting minority rights.
I've never seen a president of the United States, in effect, make himself a puppet of outside groups and choose from a group of right-wing fringe ideologues.
But blocking the appointment will be near impossible for Democrats. The Senate only needs 50 votes to confirm a Supreme Court nominee, meaning that if all but one Republican vote along party lines, they will not need any Democratic support. 3 Democrats voted in favor of President Trump's first nominee, Justice Neil Gorsuch, and newly elected red state Democrat Senator Doug Jones signaled he plans to vote independent of party.
I don't think my role is a rubber stamp for the president, but it's also not an automatic knee-jerk no either.
This as the Trump administration struggles to reunite the youngest children separated from their parents at the border before Tuesday's deadline. The administration requesting more time and releasing a list of roughly 100 kids under the age of 5 to the American Civil Liberties Union. Government officials say they still need to track down dozens of parents who are no longer in custody, including 19 who were already deported.
Vote you out! Vote you out! Where are the babies? Vote you out!
Protesters confronting McConnell about the separated children as he left a Kentucky restaurant Saturday.
What are you doing to get the babies back?
Well, these two issues are at the top of the agenda for President Trump, but it's just the beginning of what will be a pretty long week for the president. He's leaving tomorrow for Brussels, Belgium for a NATO conference with European leaders. Then on Thursday, he heads to the UK to meet with Prime Minister Theresa May and the Queen, followed by a trip to Scotland to visit his golf courses, and then on to Helsinki, Finland for that crucial meeting with Vladimir Putin. So President Trump has a lot on his plate. He's trying to get the Supreme Court decision done before he heads out of here, John.
The countdown is on. Abby, thank you. So who are the final 4? What do we know about them? What are their chances? President Trump will announce his pick for the Supreme Court tonight. The president says it is now down to 4 finalists. Let's bring in CNN chief legal analyst, former federal prosecutor Jeffrey Toobin, and CNN political analyst David Gregory. The reality show plays out tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern. We will, of course, have full coverage here. As we work up to this, though, the president keeping this very close to the vest, and yet we know there has been a significant amount, perhaps not surprisingly, of lobbying from a number of lawmakers to get the president's ear here. And one of the things we're hearing is that Mitch McConnell is saying your best bet would be the path of least resistance, Jeffrey Toobin. What do you think the chances are that the president actually goes that route?
Well, I think it is possible because he does not have much of a margin. I think that argues against Amy Barrett as a nominee. She is very young, very untested, very conservative in the views that we know she has, although her views are not known on a lot of subjects. I think she presents the most realistic possibility of being defeated as a nominee. The other 3, I think, all have very good chances of being nominees. I think their similarities are a lot bigger than their differences. They are all very conservative. They are all likely to vote to overturn abortion rights, gay rights in many situations. So I think their similarities are more important than their differences. But you have Brett Kavanaugh, who's been a very distinguished, very conservative federal appeals court judge for more than a decade. On the one hand, you have Thomas Hardiman. On the other hand, who is a much lesser known, much less intellectually distinguished judge, certainly someone who is highly competent. But they are very different in their qualifications, with Kethridge somewhere in the middle. But in terms of how they will actually vote, I think there are very few differences among all 4.
Hardiman seems to be making a late surge, David Gregory. If you pay attention to all the reporting that's been coming out over the weekend, Hardiman was the runner-up to Neil Gorsuch last time around. Hardiman also served on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals with the president's sister.
And if we believe that, in fact, the president has not already made up his mind and this is about theatrics.
That's a great point.
Yeah. It would, but it would say something about how this president likes to operate. He does like to talk to a lot of outsiders outside of the White House to get their views. And he is subject to being lobbying on these kinds of decisions, particularly around Hardiman, who's got a good biography, a little bit more hardscrabble than the establishment, judicial monastery, as some call it, of Kavanaugh and the others, with, high educational achievement and the kind of pedigree. And, you know, in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, somebody who's been working within Washington for so many years to position himself to be where he is now, which is the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is really a feeder into the Supreme Court. And so I think the president looks at all of that. I think he wants to, you know, gel with somebody. He understands that this is a decision that really does play for a legacy here, but he's also thinking about how he can argue this case throughout the summer to try to impact the midterm vote. So he's got a lot of these different calculations, but I think what's been interesting, if you look at the Gorsuch nomination, is how by the book this president treated this decision with input from the conservative intellectuals who, you know, argue in the Federalist Society and elsewhere for who is really next up and who should get this position. He hewed very closely to that with Neil Gorsuch, and I think we'll probably do the same here.
Yeah, I mean, a lot more than input. I mean, this is basically an outsourced process, but it has served him very well politically in terms of shoring up his base. And so then the question becomes, outside the pageantry and the reality show theatrics of this, does he go back to that playbook wholesale? Is he in the mood to gamble and go for a more central casting candidate like Amy Coney Barrett, who could have a real time? And the fact that McConnell's trying to push him towards more confirmable conservatives is itself fascinating.
And it's interesting that McConnell would actually be arguing, if it's true, against Brett Kavanaugh because of his lengthy paper trail. You know, the Wall Street Journal argues this morning on their editorial page, you know, that can be controlled, how much time that actually takes. I think what's important, and Jeffrey has talked about this before, we talk so much about the social issues of abortion and gay rights, but, you know, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals occupies most of its time with questions around the administrative state and the role of government with regard to regulation. That's something that conservatives care about a lot, and they've got a reliable conservative in Brett Kavanaugh on those issues.
Jeffrey?
Well, and you just have to remember how extensive the conservative agenda is here for the Supreme Court. It's not just rolling back abortion rights. It's not just rolling back gay rights. It's not just eliminating affirmative action. It's not just expanding the death penalty. It's limiting the power of government to regulate at all. It's basically taking what the conservatives did to Obamacare and do it to every law that Congress passes, whether it's environmental laws or labor protection laws, basically using the courts to squeeze the rights of individuals and the rights of the government to regulate corporations, to limit that more and more. All of that is on the table here. And the reason, I mean, just to refresh everyone's memory, the reason why this seat is so much more important than the Gorsuch for Scalia seat is that Justice Scalia was already very conservative. So it didn't change the makeup of the court very well. Anthony Kennedy was a usual Republican vote, but on a number of important issues, gay rights, abortion rights, he was with the liberals. So the replacement of Kennedy in a 5-4 court is immensely, immensely significant.
And there was immense disappointment, right, on the right. The legacy of Kennedy is one that conservatives are really sitting with great distaste.
Let me. I want to shift if I can. I want to shift if I can to the other story that I want to cover with you guys, and I think there is a tie-in here, which is the president and perhaps his own defense here in the investigation surrounding the president, because this next Supreme Court justice could have to rule on the various questions dealing with the investigation right now, namely, will Robert Mueller subpoena the president? Will he try to force the president to sit down for an interview? And I want to listen to what Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, was saying over the weekend, essentially saying it's not going to happen. I'm setting the bar so high here that it's almost impossible the president will sit down. Let's listen.
The joint defense agreement that Cohen had with the president's legal team, that is no longer operable?
I'm not really allowed to talk about that, but it wouldn't matter whether it was or it wasn't. We think we know everything we need to know at this point.
And the president's legal defense fund is no longer paying Michael Cohen's legal bills?
Again, that's not something I'm allowed to comment on, but it wouldn't matter one way or the other. We want Michael to handle this in the way that's most helpful to him. Michael's not going to lie. He's going to tell the truth. As long as he does that, we have nothing to fear. He didn't direct him to do that. What he said to him was, can you give him a break?
Comey says he took it as direction.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I've taken it that way. I mean, by that time, he had been fired. And he said a lot of other things, some of which have turned out to be untrue. The reality is...
Jeffrey, what I wanted you to hear was Rudy Giuliani over the weekend basically saying that the president's not going to sit down unless you have facts that prove a crime here. He tried to back off and say, no, I'm not saying that, but you have to have a real case here. Does Rudy Giuliani have any grounding in the actual law here when he's saying that that's the basis with which the president would sit down?
No, that's not the law of grand jury subpoenas. The law of grand jury subpoenas is that prosecutors have a great deal of latitude in asking for demanding people to testify before the grand jury. Yes, it's true the president is in a different position constitutionally than an ordinary witness, but in terms of proving that a crime had already taken place, I'm unaware of any case, any principle, any precedent that says that there is that high a bar to ask for the president's testimony. And it looks like that could lead to a lengthy court fight that may well wind up in the Supreme Court.
And it's Mueller's choice here, because it really does seem to me like Rudy Giuliani is saying it's not going to happen. If you want this to happen, you've got to force it. And then Mueller's got to make a choice, Jeffrey, correct?
Mueller's got to make a choice of whether to subpoena him. And then the president has to make a choice about whether he wants to short-circuit the whole process and take the fifth, which he could very well do. It would be embarrassing. Sure. It would be a bad couple days news story. But if there's one thing we've learned about the Trump presidency is that no news changes his real approval rating. So if he were to take the fifth, I don't think it would make that much of a difference.
A guttural laugh of David Gregory there, signifying verification of Jeffrey Toobin's point. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Coming up in our next hour, we're going to speak with President Trump's top Supreme Court advisor, Leonard Leo, with the Federalist Society about the process and if he knows whether or not a decision has been made, because he is someone who would know.
He would certainly know. Also ahead, will the U.S. government meet the deadline tomorrow? This is the deadline for the youngest of the children, about 100 of them who've been separated from their parents, kids under the age of 5. A deadline for them to be reunited. We'll ask a GOP lawmaker next.
Tomorrow to reunite children under 5 separated from their families at the border. But the U.S. government is arguing it needs more time to find dozens of parents, perhaps no longer in U.S. government custody. Now, our next guest tried last week to visit a facility that houses separated immigrant children, but was denied entry by its employees. Joining us now, Republican Congressman Jeff Denham of California. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us. Let's start with the proximate news. The government has until tomorrow to reunite the children younger than 5 with their parents. Do you think the government will meet that deadline?
There's no reason the government should not meet that deadline. HHS has said, even under the previous administration, that they've had these lists of unaccompanied minors. These kids have been treated the same way as unaccompanied minors, so there's no reason, no excuse why they wouldn't know exactly where they are all the time.
Well, look, this same administration, Secretary Azar of HHS last week gave us an estimate for the number of kids overall. He just said fewer than 3,000. He doesn't know the full number here. So it's clear that they don't have an exact accounting of where all these children are, isn't it?
Well, there's no reason they shouldn't have an exact, I would say not only exact, but to the moment, know exactly where each of these individual kids are.
So
they should. But I think that's part of the problem. And I think tomorrow is going to be self-evident on whether they know how many, where they're at, what the process is. And those are the questions I had for the facility that I went to visit. Just show us the conditions these kids are under right now and let us know. First of all, you ought to be able to tell their family, their relatives, their parents exactly the treatment that these kids have. But secondly, you ought to know immediately, if you know when the court process is, you ought to know immediately when the reunification process is.
So that facility hasn't given you those answers, the one that turned you away, not yet, correct?
Zero. I couldn't even get the director of the facility to come outside and tell me, how old is this facility? What are your hours of operation? How many kids? I mean, even the basics. I could hear her behind the door, but never open it.
Has the administration given you any answers?
No, but we had pre-cleared this. I mean, the administration knew, the White House knew, as well as HHS knew that I was going to this facility. Ultimately, a lot of what we're dealing with now is a law that needs to be changed. Both parties should be working together to craft and to pass and do it immediately. But if you can't even get these questions answered from the current administration, how does Congress do its job to actually fix the problem?
In long term, there do need to be laws passed to address this situation, but there's no question, there's no argument at this point that these children the estimate of fewer than 3,000, as HHS now says it. They were separated by a decision made by the Trump administration, separated and then not accounted for. And what I can't figure out is, we can't get answers. We've been asking these questions, but you, a Republican member of Congress, if you can't get the answers to these questions, what does that tell you?
It's certainly frustrating. Any member of Congress, doesn't matter party, you should be able to know those that are being sent to your district, those that are going to impact your district, those that are really going to impact our country. We ought to know exactly how many kids there are and what the process is for unifying them with their parents.
Is this an issue of competence or is it an issue of decency? Is the government just not up to the task of actually counting, or do they not want to?
I don't know. It'd surprise me if they don't want to, but certainly they should be able to. Whether they release all of those numbers to the public, certainly members of Congress should know exactly what those numbers are. We ought to be able to do it at a moment's notice.
You don't seem to be ruling out the possibility, though, that there is a question of will here.
Sure. This is, I think it's horrible optics.
But it's more, but you agree, and I'm not pressing you because you've been knocking on doors here. You've been trying to get answers. It's more than optics. I mean, there are 3,000 kids here. We're talking about kids that were separated from their parents by a decision made by the U.S. government. It's just not a bad look.
I would agree, but I also believe that we should know these family detention units, these resident facilities that are along the border. We're moving to expand those. We had those in my bill that failed 2 weeks ago. We should know how many more we need and what the extent of those are, not only to make sure that this process stops so that we make sure that kids are with their parents, but secondly, we've got to know exactly what this reunification process is and the timeline. And I think tomorrow is going to be pretty telling.
Congressman Jeff Denham of California, thank you for your efforts to get answers here. Keep on pushing, because we need to know the answers to these questions. Appreciate it.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Breaking news out of Thailand. Another huge development in terms of rescue operations. 2 more boys we've just learned have been rescued from that flooded cave. We want to get straight to CNN's Ivan Watson, who has the very latest there. He is live in northern Thailand. 3 in just the last few hours.
It's remarkable as the sun is setting here over Mae Sai in northern Thailand, very close to where this incredible rescue operation is underway in that mountain in the cave complex behind me. We have learned from a member of the rescue operation who's stationed at the mouth of the cave complex that 2 more boys have emerged. Rescuers have brought 2 more boys out. There was an earlier one about 2 hours ago, and that brings the total of rescues today up to 3, in addition to 4 boys who were brought successfully out of the cave complex on Sunday evening. So that would leave now 5 boys from the soccer team still inside the cave complex, as well as their 25-year-old coach. Now, the first of the boys who came out today, Monday, has already been taken by ambulance and then by military helicopter to a hospital in the provincial capital, where he is then effectively quarantined. He is not allowed to come in contact with his family, for example. Members of the families of the missing boys say that all the parents are remaining basically up at the base camp up on the mountain because they've decided that they'll all leave when all the children have been rescued. Now, the 2 most recent rescues, Erica, were told by this member of the rescue operation that they're currently being reviewed at the field hospital that has been erected there at what you could describe as base camp. And that seems to be the pattern that we've seen for the previous rescues as well. But again, another potentially positive development. We don't have details on the medical condition of these 2 most recent rescues, but clearly this multinational team that is engaging in this very dangerous work that claimed the life of one former Thai SEAL Navy diver just last week are hard at work. They've been at work for some 7 hours now, and they are bringing people from inside the cave complex. Erica and John?
That makes 3 today, Ivan, on top of 4 yesterday. Are there limitations? Yesterday, we understand they had to stop after 4 to restock the oxygen tanks along the path there. Are those Are still those limitations today?
Not entirely clear, but the narrative that the Thai officials gave yesterday was after extracting 4 of the boys who are said to be in good condition now and have been requesting one of their favorite Thai dishes, actually, today from the hospital, that they had run out of their oxygen supplies for the procedure and they had to basically rest and restock for the next day. So, you know, the question is will they have more supplies for the operation this time? And recall that the round trip for divers to and from the cave where these kids have been hiding, which is about 2.5 miles into the mountain, is roughly an 11-hour round trip journey. So that burns oxygen for the divers going in and then coming out. We also have heard that the children that have been extracted have been brought out with kind of full air face masks because, of course, these kids are not trained scuba divers. This is, as I mentioned before, very dangerous for even trained professionals. And some of these kids, frankly, just can't swim. So, again, a perilous and dangerous journey, but one that seems to be bearing fruit as the sun is setting here, of course, deep beneath the mountain. It doesn't matter whether it is night or day, it's dark. And some of these passages are flooded with water. And fortunately, there's been one very positive development. The forecasts of downpours of rain have not materialized thus far. So that means there has not been an inundation of additional water into the cave complex, and presumably that makes the rescue operation much easier.
All right,
John and Erica?
We'll continue to follow those developments, but again, a sixth and seventh boys out. It is really remarkable. Ivan, thank you. And we'll continue to check in with Ivan and Matt Rivers, who's at the hospital as well. Just ahead, a new report tying Donald Trump to Russia back in 1987. How did that shape his worldview?
On CNN.
The minister in charge of negotiating Britain's exit from the European Union has resigned. David Davis says he couldn't support Prime Minister Theresa May's negotiating approach. Meantime, a new article in New York Magazine makes some startling and some familiar accusations about just how involved Russia may have been in the Brexit campaign. We're joined by the writer of that story, Jonathan Chait. It is a fascinating read, to put it mildly. But what the case you lay out here for the similarities in terms of what we saw for the campaigning of Brexit and what we saw during the 2016 election campaign here in the United States is fascinating. What do you see as the similarities? Why do you believe that these two are so closely parallel?
Well, it actually parallels the way Russia has operated in a wide array of Western countries in the last several years. Russia courts right-wing allies and tries to gain their support for foreign policy and aids them with a combination of overt and covert actions to try to help them gain power through elections. What they did in Britain is especially close to what they did in the United States. It happened in about the same time, and months apart in 2016. In Britain, what they did was to meet with the backer of the Brexit campaign. The Brexit campaign, you have to understand, served Russia's interest because Russia, for decades, has tried to split Western allies apart from each other to try to weaken that united front against Russia. And so they wanted Brexit to succeed. They wanted Britain to leave the European Union, to split